firstly, I want to welcome you all to ESB, but actually I should probably saying thank you for welcoming me, because your building here is beautiful and I know it is sustainable and green and it's just such a wonderful location. So thank you all for having me. Delighted to welcome Marguerite Sayers. You've been 30 years here with ESB as Deputy Chief Executive, and I'd say you've seen so many changes over the years. But what for you was that moment you thought, yes, this is going to work?
Okay, I suppose when you join the company, you become very aware of the history and the legacy, and it's very hard to talk about kind of changes without, even though it hasn't been in the last 30 years, rural electrification, because I really think that that was just transformative for Ireland. I was thinking the other day about if you had to do your washing without running water, without hot water, without a washing machine, and you're taking your clothes off to a river or waiting until the kettle boiled in the open fire, it was absolute drudgery, I suspect. And our world now is so much different from that. And that was enabled by the rollout of electricity in rural parts of the country. So through the 40s and 50s was about 400,000 homes that were electrified. And we're building on that legacy all of the time. And I suppose, like you said, the challenge for us now is to take the carbon out of electricity and help people to electrify even more. So some of the things that I suppose I've noticed, it's actually 34 years, it's more than 30, would have been looking back at, again, these predated that time, but Money Point generating station made a huge difference to Ireland's energy independence. When gas prices were high, we had coal. When coal prices were high, we had gas. Also, Thurlock Hill, I think, was an amazing engineering feat and a really brave move by ESB. And both of those stations are really important now. They provide backup and grid stability. So it means we can have renewables, but we still have security of supply. So they were huge. Now, they were back in the 70s and the 80s. But the things that have happened, I suppose, since I joined, even thinking of appliances, I do remember the first video recorder coming into the house at home, and that was before I joined ESB. I remember the first microwave, and I suppose a little bit like rural electrification and what came into houses, they kind of represented a little bit of freedom, more freedom way back, but a little bit of freedom, because for the younger people here, streaming hasn't always been a thing. If you missed the thing on television, you weren't going to see it again. So you had to stay at home if you really wanted to see something. And video recorders gave people that freedom. Same thing happened with microwaves. And the really big change, I suppose, was the internet and the level of information it gave people. So now that they could get information for themselves, they didn't have to wait for it. And again, all of those things are underpinned by electricity. There's a few other real milestones. We had the deregulation of the electricity industry and the advent of having a regulator. And some people are quite negative about that. You get that kind of commentary at times in the press around we had the cheapest electricity until the regulator came in and now we don't. And they probably didn't see what was behind the curtain, which was our network at that stage was in really, really poor order. And one of the jobs of the regulator is to look and say, actually, that might keep prices down in the short term, but it's actually not in your long-term interest. It's not in the long-term interest of customers of the country. So having a regulator meant that we actually were able to put a lot of investment into our network, and that underpinned economic development. So that was a really big one. Another one that a lot of people don't know of, which is again behind the curtain, was 20 kV conversion, which is something that everybody in ESB networks and parts of ESB know about, but generally the public don't. So the backbone of our electricity system is operating, or was operating, up until the 90s at 10,000 volts. And that's the bit just before it comes into your house. It doesn't come into your house at 10,000 volts. It comes in at 230. But right up to that, we have a huge network out there of 10 kV network. And we converted in the last 30 years about 60 to 70% of that network to operate at 20,000 volts. And that means it can take twice the amount of energy, and it does that with a quarter of the losses. So just to explain, every line and every cable that's out there, some of the energy is lost to the atmosphere, kind of just heating it. It's just lost. And two things that happened with that 20 kV conversion mean that we now have maybe half the amount of rural network as we would otherwise have had. And therefore, we don't have to maintain twice the amount of network as we otherwise would have had. People don't have to look at twice the amount of lines. So that's really important. And secondly, we saved by doing that, and it was the brainchild of a man called Noel Tobin and his manager at the time, John Kirby. And because of it, we have saved the amount of energy that's used in about 200,000 homes. So people don't know that, they don't see it. But that is probably one of the biggest environmental projects we've had. So I thought that was a game changer. And then more recently, people having the ability, if they can afford it and if they have the space, to have solar panels on their roofs. They have a smart meter, they potentially have an EV. So that democratization of energy, that you're going from having a system where you had a small number of huge generators and now you have distributed generation, which is typically renewable, and then within people's homes they have their own micro generation and they're much more conscious. Anyone I've met that has, particularly if they have a battery as well, they have a battery, they have solar panels and they have an EV, they are so clued in to the cost of energy, the availability of it, when to charge, when to put on the appliances, etc. So that has been a big game changer as well. And the one other one, and it's only the last one, I know it's a long answer. It was another innovation project by ESB, but it was to use the electricity system to bring high-speed broadband to different parts of the country. And again, that did two things. So we know how reliant we are now on smart devices, on the internet and information, on AI, all of that. And Cyro, which is a joint venture with Vodafone, now passes almost 700,000 premises. So they now have access to that high-speed broadband. So those 700,000 premises have that choice. But on top of that, it really, that the entry of that Cyro product really shook up the internet market. And I think other players now provide full broadband and full fibre broadband that mightn't have done so if it wasn't for that. So there's been a lot that has happened, both from a data point of view, a telecoms point of view, and an energy point of view in the last 35 years.
Incredible. It actually kind of leads me on to my next question. But before that, just some of the points you touched on. And I've seen with some of my own friends now who've been buying these brand new homes and these smart homes. And I just find it so incredible when you go in and they've all these different, everything is just so electrified and everything's so smart and everything is just so technological. And it's incredible because like they can show me their app on their phone and, you know, like the usage. And it's like, I think when you see it, when you see how much you're using, you kind of go, whoa, okay, right, where can I make changes? And then you mentioned earlier about, you know, we take for granted probably how many items in our home and how often we rely on electricity. You mentioned washing clothes there. I remember when I was traveling a couple of years ago and having to hand wash all our clothing, and I was like, how can people do this? It's like, it was so hard, and then trying to get everything dry, and then even things like not having electric showers. Like we were in parts of Africa and we barely even had running water, and I remember thinking, you know, we're so blessed here in Ireland for what we have, and just not really even realising what's behind it all, which does go on to our next question about when we do turn on the lights at home. And you've probably mentioned some items there that I've certainly never heard of, and I know you're all very familiar with it. But it got to me just thinking about how, I guess, I don't know what goes on behind the scenes. As I said, I turn on the switch, I put on the electric shower, I turn it off, I leave. But also, you know, that way in which we use energy at home. And that brings you on to the next question about the new innovations and projects that you're working on.
Yeah, and there's a huge variety of those in different ways, because I suppose people don't want to know what's going on behind the curtain, and that makes sense. But there are some things that we have to do in order to enable renewables. So at times you hear from people, why can't we just have 100% renewables, and why can't we do that now? And it's not that simple, unfortunately, because one of the things, for example, and it's only one example, that when we had those big generators that were rotating at 3,000 revs per minute, they provide inertia. So it means if something happens to the system, they're already in motion and they're going to stay moving until something else comes in to replace whatever fault has happened, whatever has tripped, whatever has gone. And that inertia is really important to keep a system stable. And if you think about it, in solar panels, there's no moving parts. And certainly on wind turbines, they're not operating at that frequency. They're not turning at 3,000 revs per minute. So you need something else. I suppose so. One of the things that we have done fairly recently, for example, is to try and replace that inertia, is to put a synchronous compensator into Money Point generating station. And it doesn't actually generate any electricity, but what it does is it provides that mechanical inertia. And again, that's something that enables renewables. So there are things that are happening all the time that maybe people are not interested in, but if they weren't there, they'd see the impact of it, which might be something like what happened in Iberia earlier this year. So providing that stability has become really difficult. So the more and more renewables we have, and we actually have a really high penetration of renewables in Ireland for the size of our country. At one stage, I think we were about second in the world relative to the size of the load that we have. So we have some serious successes. That has gone down now, I think, to sixth or seventh. But we're doing well on renewable energy generation. We need to do more in terms of our homes, do more in terms of our businesses being energy efficient. So in terms of the projects, we've got whole different suites of projects. So the innovation team are working on a lot of things. We've got innovation units in different parts of ESB. So first of all, as a broad term, kind of using data analytics and data to do things better. So we're doing things pretty well already, but to do them better. So using drones to survey network, taking that information and identifying places that might be susceptible to significant storm damage. We have the eHub that you mentioned earlier on, so helping people to experience electrified transport, providing charging infrastructure. We have a really interesting project which actually has worked in the past to provide a repair. So it's a Habitat is the name of the project, so providing an underwater chambers, because we know that interconnectors and offshore energy is going to be so important in future, but you've got to connect that, and if anything happens you have to repair it. And this is a unit that allows repairs on the seabed without having to bring the cable right up to the surface of the sea, and that's now on its third generation, so that's one we're working on. We have got projects around helping data centres to be more energy efficient, to help with, say, our telecoms industry to be more resilient. We see again what happened to communications during the storm. A lot of work on batteries, an awful lot of work and research on e-fuels and that kind of storage area, because there's a lot happening in batteries, which is kind of the game changer. When you're dealing with renewables, you don't have energy necessarily when you want it, depending on whether it's at night and you don't have the light or whether the wind isn't blowing. So to have the ability to store energy is huge for the energy transition. So a lot of work happening there. And then there's other things like we have a pilot happening at the moment in Carrington, where there is an autonomous robot that's going into a confined space a couple of times a day. A human used to do it, but there's some risk associated with that. And it collects the data and uploads it, and then it's analysed, etc. So lots of pilots like that at any point in time. I think at the moment we have about 48 different pilots, but at any point in time there's probably 25 fairly significant projects that are happening. We get feedback from customers that they don't see ESB as innovative, but actually the research and the opinions we've got from entities that have come in and audited ESB is different. So we've got the EFQM, the European Foundation for Quality Management, awarded ESB 6 out of 7 stars for innovation. And another entity that checks, I suppose, the level of innovation across utilities, it's an American Power Research Institute, EPRI. They said that actually from their point of view, ESB is right up there and is global leading, I think were the words that they used. So there's a lot of stuff happening behind the curtain. There's a couple of things, Cyro that I mentioned earlier, that started out as an innovation project, and actually e-cars and the charging network we have, that also started out as an innovation project. So I'm not even doing justice to everything that's happening, but just to mention some of them. But there's an awful lot going on, and a few in there that if they happen would be real game changers, particularly I think something around e-fuels. If we could get an answer on e-fuels and storage, they're two of the big ones that we have yet to crack.
You mentioned there about the drones. Now, I don't know if it's the same system, but I was at the ploughing championships and I saw the drones that they are now using for spreading fertiliser on farms, and it is incredible. Well, firstly, the size of the drone, and I was like, this drone is huge, and he said, that's not even the biggest one. He said, they're using that now because they're trying to cut back on what they're using, so they're trying to find ways to be sustainable. And the drones, it's just amazing to see now what drones can do. So I guess in more of a visual way, can you explain how the drones actually work and operate? Do you literally just someone sends them off into the hard to reach areas? And
so I'm not a drone pilot. I tried, it crashed. But, to speak to that, actually, there's another project which you didn't mention, which we're looking at as well, which is, because it is, the drones are based on batteries and electricity. The more we decarbonise electricity, the more then we can use, what the decarbonised electricity, the more zero fuel and low carbon options that we've got. So there's another project we have around potentially using the routes of our electricity lines to have those bigger drones to deliver parcels and packages. A lot of debate at the moment about you getting your pizza and your coffee delivered to your house. I can understand that. But for longer distances with those bigger drones, that certainly is something that could have a lot of potential. The one, and it has nothing to do with us, but the one that I thought was really impressive when I heard about it was the ability to deliver a defibrillator to somebody having a heart attack and skip past all of the traffic. So, you know, there's positives as well as negatives to all of these things, and we're hoping if we can prove, you know, that drone route technology works, that would reduce the amount of emissions you have from lorries and deliveries on an ongoing basis around the country if it's something that people want to use. And given that it would be the route of the electricity lines, it wouldn't disturb people in the same way as you have the controversy at the moment about you know, drones potentially flying over people's back gardens.
No, it is amazing. And just even to touch on what you said there, and I know you mentioned the charging points, and when we recorded the episode about EVs, I'll admit I have a petrol and a diesel now, but I had a petrol at the time, and I was of the mindset, well, I couldn't get an EV because I don't have a charging point at home. But I actually was given an electric vehicle a couple of weeks ago to test drive for about 2 weeks. And again, I think I was up to 90 before I collected it, because I kept thinking, what's going to happen? What if I break down? What if I lose battery? X, Y, Z. But when I actually started driving it, it was so nice to drive. It was so smooth, but it was so clever and innovative that it was just able to, like, if the charge went to a certain point, it could say, here's a charging point. So the first time I ever charged the car was actually an ESB point on a motorway somewhere that stopped in, and I remember it was dark and I got out of the car and I looked at it and I went, I don't even know how to charge this. And because I forgot to ask now obviously it's very explanatory, so I did actually get on the internet and was like, how do I charge this car? And it was obviously just a case of plugging it in, which I found out eventually. But that was the first time I used it. And I have, my home house doesn't have a charging point, and my rental house in Dublin doesn't have a charging point. And actually I had zero problems for the whole 2 weeks. So it made me really realise and really rethink now that I actually can get an EV next, because it was very, very manageable, because there are more and more points.
It is, and I suppose, well, there's a couple of things. First of all, you mentioned not knowing what to do. There are fantastic conversations that happen every day of the week at those hubs where people are, like, it's a community that wants to help each other, because everybody knows what it's like to be doing your first charge. And the second thing, I suppose, the range of cars. Like, I got a call the other day. My car is only 18 months old, but they never miss an opportunity. So there's a new version of it coming out. So I got a phone call from the dealer going, would you be interested in the new one? I said, I still think my car is new, but the range is predicted to be 800 kilometres. What I've got at the moment is probably less than 400. So when you've got a country the size of Ireland, when you get to those kind of ranges, then the range anxiety goes away, particularly if you have if you're lucky enough to have a charger at home or somewhere else that that you can use it at your destination. But you're right, you don't need to spend forever charging en route. You only need enough to get you back to where your chargers that you're familiar with are.
So moving on to diversity, obviously it's a key driver for innovation. So it's very important for Ireland's energy future and for climate and this whole net zero that we speak about. So yeah, how can we bring diversity to the fore when it comes to innovation?
Well, we kind of have to, I suppose, because no one person has all the answers, no one company has all the answers. So it's really important that we make use of all of the viewpoints, all of the information. I think it's one of the reasons that collaborations are becoming more a feature of the energy transition, because there's a lot of risk in some of these things. There always is with innovation. So if you can spread that risk by having partners, first of all, you increase your chances of success, but then you also spread the risk a little bit as well. It's also important, so, there's that diversity of thought that comes from different entities, different companies. Obviously, we have all the factors of diversity within the company as well. And we do try and include as many people as possible. We run some internal programs to make sure that we're getting people trained in kind of innovative thinking, and then take the output of that and we kind of work on those ideas afterwards. We've a program called X-Potential in Excite. The other thing is we're part of a big sort of a startup innovation hub called Free Electrons, and that has been going. ESB was one of the founder members. So that is now going into, we're heading towards a decade of free electrons. And that is people who are very innovative, who have technology that they think can be adapted, and they've got use cases within the electricity industry, and they bring it to 7 utilities, international utilities. And actually the grand finale of that is in Dublin. ESB is hosting it just across the way there. At the moment, I think we have 48 live projects that have come out of free electrons, and it's expected that that's going to deliver value of somewhere around 30 million. And there's a lot of the solutions to the problems we're grappling with that come out of exactly that. For the startups, it's great because they can pitch ideas to the big companies who probably have more capital than the startups to be able to use them. And an awful lot, I think, of what's happened in innovation in general is that somebody has technology for some reason, but actually you can adapt it to use in a different industry. And that's sometimes where the magic happens. And that's what free electrons is great at doing. So we recognise we by no means have all the answers, and that gives us great exposure to all the latest thinking and the international companies and the startups that are out there. And we'll see what's going to emerge this year. And that will give rise to a number of additional pilots that we'll be testing.
Watch this space. Now, moving on, 2027, obviously a massive year, the centenary for ESB. Ardnacrusha, I lived down in Limerick for years and I've always known about it. Well, actually, I knew where it was. And it was only through Energise that I found out what exactly it has done. And that was just so ahead of its time back then. And like it's such a, I guess, a prominent feature now for anyone that lives in that part of the country. Like we often used to drive past it and always knew what Ardnacrusha knew something about it, I guess, but in a more, I suppose I knew it more on the consumer level, but since Energise, I know all about it. You know, it's a kind of tricky one to ask, but what do you think is going to happen for the next 100 years for ESB? And I guess the way that I'm assuming that we'll have flying cars by then.
Starting with an easy one. Yeah. So back to Ardnacrusha, look, it's fantastic. And I think all of us that learned about Ardnacrusha in school, it doesn't happen anymore, but it did in my generation. You still kind of get butterflies or the hair stand up the back of your head when you go into the site, because it was such a big risk for the country to take and made such a difference to the development of Ireland. And it's still delivering today. So, you know, there's been refurbishment has happened on those units, but they're still delivering. It's the original renewables and they're still delivering electricity. And also very important in terms of that stability. So what's going to happen next? I don't know. I know what I hope will happen. So I hope that we certainly take advantage of the resources that we have in Ireland, and there's a huge amount of objections to things, and it's good for people to have their say, but I think they don't always take into account A, the greater good, and B, what as a country we're saying no to by saying no to developing our renewables. So that's one of the key things, that we take advantage of our existing natural resources and can capture them. There's some technology advances that we do need. So we need a bit more technology advancement on floating offshore so that we can use our wind resource off the west coast. And that is something that would be a game changer for us. Having a big national storage solution. Certainly we've been operating on the basis of having hydrogen as that storage solution. There's a little bit of a slowdown in terms of research in hydrogen right now, but that could come back. There was a slowdown in EV sales as we were talking about them in 2024, and they're back with a bang in 25, so these things have cycles. But we do need batteries or hydrogen or something to happen at national scale, so we do have storage, or what they're doing in maybe some other countries is carbon capture and storage, so some one of those solutions is necessary. But that bit of us using all of our collective abilities to deliver what we need as a country, that greater good bit, whether we do what we can in our homes, if we get more conscious about waste of energy, because that's also a way of really contributing, so don't waste energy. And then to look as a country at what we can do best to secure our own green future, which brings with it our economic future. And if we can do that, then I'm hopeful for the future. So storage and renewables would be two very big ones.
For anyone that's listening or watching right now and, you know, they're a customer and I'm sure they've been really well educated just even listening to you, I know I have been. Is there any kind of one bit of advice that maybe you just have on maybe a personal level you kind of think maybe that someone could change right now or bring into their everyday to maybe just be that bit greener and maybe make them think twice about what they're doing?
Yeah, so almost all homes in the country at this stage, over 2 million premises, have got a smart meter. And it doesn't matter who your supplier is, you can use the data that you get from that meter. And that's kind of frightening for some people, but there's more and more platforms there now that will allow you to take a fairly simple data file that you can get really easily by signing up to the platform, and you plug in that data file and it tells you what the best tariff for you is. So it's good for you in terms of money use. But the reason that those tariffs are there is because there's more energy available when it's windy. There's more energy available at night, really, because the wind blows at night, but people aren't using the same volume of electricity. So if you charge your EV at night, you get a really good rate. So what's underpinning those tariffs is the availability of good green energy. So that's something I think that a lot of people can do, and they don't always know that they can do it, or they're a little bit scared of doing it. And it's a pretty simple thing to do. So that's one thing. Looking at the insights, if your supplier provides those. So there are things you can do by certainly engaging with your smart meter. That's one that's very simple. And smart meters are like, they're not just, they don't just have the functionality people are used to right now. They are going to allow people to have much more control in future. So all of those meters, if the suppliers want to activate it, have the ability to be pay-as-you-go meters, for example. So there's been new services coming in future as well.
I think everyone wants to, I suppose, save money at the end of the day. That's actually a really good tip. Marguerite Sayers of ESB, thank you so much for having us here in ESB, and thank you all for being here. And don't forget to listen to Energise, available on all podcast platforms.
Thanks, Megan.